All right, so my name is Tyler Henry. I am from the Williamsport area. I grew up in Jersey Shore, not New Jersey, Anthony. The cooler Jersey Shore. We have lots of cattle and a river. And I work with a ministry called Ratio Christi, and we serve college students, and we do apologetics, and that is our evangelistic tool. And the whole thing with Ratio Christi is to change lives so that we can transform culture. And we do that through apologetics and deep critical thinking. One of the main schools that I work at is Lake Cumming College, and their motto is think deeply, act boldly. And it fits so well with what we're doing here this weekend, and I'm super excited to walk through creation with you. We read 1 Peter a little bit ago, and that is one of my favorite books, mainly because as an apologist, this is where we kind of get the word apologetics from. So as we are thinking through our faith, I want to ask you also to not just think about your faith, but think also how it's going to apply in each individual portion of your life. So it's not just apologetics sometimes is seen as almost completely outward focused, but I firmly believe that apologetics is also inwardly focused as well. So it's pastoral at first. It's something for us, but then at the same time, as we get filled up, it's something that naturally outpours into our lives. So we're going to talk a little bit about creation tonight, and not young Earth or old Earth, or theistic evolution. I'm not just going to give evidence for each one of those positions or just one position. We're going to touch on topics that touch those because they're going to shape how we look at the different positions. And, each of us are going to have our own particular stance that we favor. What I want you to do is think about that. Think about what your particular position is in the creation debate. And I'm not saying disbelieve it. What I'm saying is set it aside so that we can observe what we see, what we read in the Bible, and then see if it matches up with not just our position, but also the science and the world around us. Because God gave us the world, and he gave us minds to be able to think through and think about the world well. And I want to do that through two passages, Genesis 1 and Psalm 19. But I don't want to just leave it there with just taking it from the Bible. I want to bring in some of the other aspects of life. I'm philosophically minded, so we're going to definitely hit on a lot of the philosophy behind the thinking about creation. But what I don't want to do is go into some of the evidences for any one of the positions, like I already said. So for this type of awareness that we're doing, and it's going to help us think well about our own view, but then also the other views that are in competition with ours. But at the same time, we also want to think well about others and their views of the same doctrine. So without sacrificing, we don't want to sacrifice a winfulness in Christ-like love. So if we do that, we might as well not have the conversation. I have two main goals that I want you to take away from this. To get you guys to be more confident in your own position, or maybe even switch your position, or maybe think about switching your position. And to also expand what you might consider to be orthodox within Christianity. So orthodoxy is broader than what some of us might think. So with Genesis 1 and Psalm 19, what we're going to try to do is glean the minimum amount of data that is not biased towards one position or the other. And that's going to keep us humble and willing to go where the evidence leads us, whether that's biblical, theological, scientific, philosophical, wherever it leads. As truth seekers and as truth dealers, we want to maintain as straight of a line towards truth as possible. And the evidence is going to lead us there. So we're going to have Genesis 1 up there. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So what does this mean? Honestly, just that God exists and that he created everything. It's pretty minimal when you think about it. But at the same time, there's going to be other, like we already mentioned, there's going to be your own particular stance is going to influence how you read this and how you interpret it. But if we just take this plain reading of Genesis 1:1, we see that all we get is that a singular God exists. And this God is the creator of the universe. And the implication for this is that God is immensely powerful, so powerful that he didn't need any help from any other God. And then Genesis 1:26 and 28. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth." God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it." So what does this mean? At face value, it's that humanity, number one, is made in God's image and is commanded to steward the earth as God would. The more you get to know me, the more you're going to realize that if I can kind of import or slide in the image of God into a conversation about theology or philosophy or anything like that, I'm going to. So this is like one of my favorite passages. But the implication here is that we share certain properties with God or attributes with God, and to not know about the universe that we live in is to not know how to take care of it. So we need to look outward to the universe, figure it out and how it works so that we can be good stewards of it. But as image bearers, we are going to also need to look out, but also up. Because if we don't look up, then we're going to kind of lose bearing. So if we're going to summarize all of this with Genesis 1:1 and 26 and 28, we can come up with a single personal God, that he exists, that created everything, including humanity in his own image. Honestly, you could probably summarize all of Genesis 1 like that. And that's the bare minimum that we need to be biblically faithful as we look at the world. So our next passage is Psalm 19, 1 through 4a. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the expanse proclaims the work of his hands. Day after day they pour out speech. Night after night they communicate knowledge. There is no speech. There are no words. Their voice is not heard. Their message has gone out to the whole earth, and their words to the end of the world. There's a lot here that I wish I could unpack. But that's going to take us like way out in the left field and maybe even another stadium that we could probably fill Beaver Stadium with how much information is packed into that. But at the bare minimum, these short 4.5 verses gives us that the world we live in is intelligible and point, maybe even scream, of God's magnificence. And that as we are made in God's image, we should utilize the unique giftings, which is Romans 12, that we all have to understand the world so that we can understand aspects of God. So learning about the world that we live in is going to also get us to learning about God. Big fancy term for that is called natural theology. So we're going to go from the nature to the theos. But those are the two core texts that we're going to be working with tonight. But I also want to bring in some of the philosophical issues that are surrounding these, how we read these passages, plus how we read the world around us. It's a big word called concordism. And there are three types of it. So this comes from one of my favorite philosophers, William Lane Craig. And he's quoting another philosopher, Dennis Alexander, in these definitions. And I thought they captured so well the different views of how science and theology relate. So the first definition is the attempt to extract modern scientific information from scriptural passages. Number two, the attempt to interpret scriptural texts in light of modern science. And number three, the attempt to integrate the independently discovered findings of contemporary science and biblical theology into a synoptic worldview. Think about it. Take a few seconds. Which one of those do you fit into? 1, 2, or 3? Because there's some dangers within the first two, if you find yourself in either one. And it's called a category fallacy or a category error whenever we do either one of these two. Number one, the Bible's not a science textbook. Yes, there are scientific things within the Bible, but the Bible is God's revelation to us of himself working in history. Science might confirm it, and they might talk about some science-related things, but we're talking about creation right now, so science, Genesis 1 and Psalm 19 are not necessarily going to give us, hear me out, not necessarily going to give us how God created everything. The second type, the second definition also tries to make the Bible fit into current science. And I don't think that that's very good either. It's still a category fallacy. And honestly, if we're doing that, we're kind of guilty of eisegesis. We're importing something into the text and making the text fit that, rather than saying, hey, okay, what is the Bible saying? And then how do we make sense of that in light of what we know with the rest of Scripture, but also with the world that we live in? So that leaves us with the third definition. And this is what Christians should strive to use. So let me read the third definition again. To attempt to integrate independently discovered findings of the contemporary science and biblical theology into a synoptic worldview. So a synoptic worldview is going to be a combination of the two so that they are in harmony. Why should we do that? We already kind of talked about it. There's science and there's theology over here. In history, we got this cool little phrase that theology is the queen of the sciences. But at the same time, we also need to understand that is it might help guide us, but it's not going to give us scientific information. It's just going to help guide us so that we know how to maybe interpret the data that we get from science in a right and God-honoring manner. But this third definition understands the book of nature in the book of Scripture. And a couple different people have used this. So Isaac Newton wrote all about this. Everyone knows Isaac Newton from his laws of gravity. If you were to actually throw up how much work he put into science versus theology, you could probably stack the books up here like this for science, and then theology is about here. It's insurmountable. It's about double what he wrote. But then it can also be traced to Augustine. Augustine kind of thought the exact same way, that there are two different books. And we get the book of science, or the book of nature, and the book of Scripture. So the book of nature, which is attested by Psalm 19, leads us to Scripture. So if we were to read the rest of Psalm 19, we would see that we see a natural flow from the world to Scripture. So when you think about it, that's kind of how the world works. We didn't have Scripture before we had the world, right? So just when we think about all the different avenues and different perspectives to look at Scripture, we see that God created the world, and then Moses wrote all of that down. But this book of Scripture that we are being led to is not devoid of philosophical and theological questions. The former is foundational. It is how we understand the world. Philosophy helps us understand the world around us, where theology helps us understand the purpose of the world. And it frees us image bearers to explore the world using what we can to find out the facts about reality. So Augustine had this really, really cool quote in On Christian Doctrine. It says, "Let every good and true Christian understand that wherever truth may be found, it belongs to his master." That does not mean that only and all truth comes from Christian scientists regarding the world that we live in. And that does not mean, I'm going to repeat that again, because that's very crucial for how we can understand science. That it does not mean that only and all truth must come from Christian scientists. There are other image bearers. If every human being is made in the image of God, then every human being has the same exact access to truth. Because if we do that, then we're kind of guilty of what's called standpoint epistemology, and we don't want to do that. Because that's going to say that those who are oppressed, have a better understanding of reality. And that's going to favor one over the other regarding image bearers. And that's kind of anti-biblical. But then the book of Scripture then leads us to Jesus, naturally. How are we doing? We good? All right, cool. We're going to move on to what sometimes is kind of implicit within especially public school. I'm a public school kid, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. I loved my time in public school, but there is this concept of scientism that is not made explicit. So there's a difference between science and scientism. So what is science, and how are these different? So science is the careful study of Scripture and the behavior of the physical world, especially by watching, measuring, and doing experiments, and the development of theories to describe the results of these activities. Now let's compare that to scientism. That this is the only path to knowledge of reality, so the world that we live in, is through the hard sciences. So those hard sciences are like chemistry, biology, and physics. Depending on who you talk to, they're going to be like, yeah, just go to physics and it'll explain everything. And then until you talk to the physicist and be like, no, go to quantum physics. And then if you talk to the quantum physicist, they'll probably be like, we don't know what we're talking about. They do. It's just no one has a comprehensive understanding of quantum physics. But this is the modern standard that's within the sciences right now, and that kind of comes from a few different things in history, and we're going to get to how we've gotten here in a little bit, but it's crucial that we understand that scientism is an outgrowth of naturalism and physicalism. They're two related but distinct ideas. Naturalism is that the universe contains only natural things, material stuff, and that there's no supernatural anything. Physicalism, on the other hand, is that all substances at the base and most fundamental are physical at their very core. There's no such thing as mental or immaterial things. So scientism then doesn't consider philosophical, theological, or theoretical truths to exist. So that kind of says math is out the door. Math doesn't give us is not provable at that point, because math, as you get into some of the philosophy of numbers and math and science, you're going to meet some people who are like, yeah, these are all abstract objects, and if they're abstract, then according to naturalism and physicalism and scientism, these don't exist. So what do we do with that? Then the number 5 then is kind of out there somewhere in the physical world. Or that 5 is just a helpful way to describe things. But there's a lot more wrong with that, where as they start to talk about these things, as they're talking, these ideas are then also not physical ideas. Or they're non-physical ideas, and they're trying to say that everything is physical, and that just doesn't work. But there's a difference here. One is truly aimed at finding the truth, no strings attached. And the other is only wanting a certain type of truth with one really large string attached. So if you sever that really large string, the entire thing falls. Christians should be interested in doing science and not be guilty of scientism. In fact, we should fight hard against scientism, because scientism can't verify itself by the hard sciences, and therefore it's self-defeating. So the phrase that science is the best way to knowledge, if you were to actually ask them to prove that, they would have to go to biology, physics, or chemistry to prove that. And you can't prove that science is the best way to knowledge, because that is a philosophical statement. So this leaves the door and the opportunity wide open for Christians to enter the sciences and philosophy of science to help combat this scientism. So how did we get here? How did we get to this point? And honestly, it all comes down to culture and the academy relationship. So this is a lot of it is stemming from the universities, which is why I work on college campuses. Because if we can get the universities to be more, or I should say less, scientistic, scientismistic, however the grammar works there, I'm not sure. This is why I'm a philosophy guy, not a grammar guy. Because if we can affect that, then everything else in the culture is going to shift and change. So especially if we can get the professors to change. So if we can do maybe some professor ministry and actually pour into our professors, especially if we know them and they go to church with us, or we meet them at the coffee shop or something like that, and start working with them, then they're going to impact thousands of students, where me, as a single person who's only interacting with a handful, can only do so much. So this all kind of started with Darwin, Hume, and Kant. So that is Charles Darwin, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant. And when they entered the scene, they gave room for naturalism to take hold. And our modern way of viewing science has kind of pretty much done away with this idea of the preconceiver. And this is all a product of the Enlightenment. You know, I love the Enlightenment. I think it gave us a ton of great things. But what it didn't give us that was so great, or what it did give us that wasn't so great, is naturalism. And this is that scientific materialism rules the day. This is the only way to do science. And the Enlightenment theists, because all of the Enlightenment thinkers weren't all atheistic. A lot of them were still theistic, but they just kind of like stayed in their corner. They didn't really come out and say, yeah, no, that doesn't make sense. They just kind of let it go. And because of that, naturalism gained cultural prominence, which then fueled eugenics, the eugenics movement, which gave rise to organizations like Planned Parenthood. There's a really, really cool quote that I heard recently in a debate with Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. He was debating Lawrence Krauss at DebateCon, and this quote, I laugh every time that I hear it, because it's just kind of, I don't know why he would have said what he did, but it's Lawrence Krauss, and he just kind of says things. But he says that what they, meaning the Christian missionaries, brought that was good was medicine, and that comes from science, which comes from a secular society. What Krauss fails to understand and realize is that most of the science, the big sciences that we understand now today, came from Christians. Louis Pasteur was a Christian. Isaac Newton was a Christian. You name it. In big scientific discoveries, you're probably going to find a Christian that was at the feet of that, at the source of that discovery. So he's kind of removing and kind of being ahistorical as a scientist. And that's kind of sad when you think about it, because as a scientist, he should be relishing in those discoveries and giving credit where credit's due, but he's not. Which comes from his view that scientism is true. And it generally feels better and a lot more stable than supernaturalism, to be honest. When we sit down and we think about it, it is much easier to say, there's no God. There's no God behind any of this, because we can't see, feel, or experience him on a regular basis. Jesus isn't alive anymore, or to us, he is. But to them, he just died. So it's easier to go that route. And that's because we can't manipulate anything supernatural to our will, and that is kind of, to the scientism person, outside of the realms of science, which it is. It's a philosophical and theological question. Because it places us below something in the great chain of being. And as humans, we're not cool with that. Because to us, we are the top of the chain. We are the top of the food chain, not below something else. But that shouldn't necessarily bother the naturalist, because there's always something coming next in human evolution. So regardless of where we are today, according to the naturalist who's holding to a strong view of evolution, there's always going to be one thing above us. It's a never-ending cycle. So let's kind of bring this home a little bit. So we've talked a lot about science, the ideas around science, some of the philosophy of science, a little bit of the history behind it, kind of how we got here, and some scriptural passages that help support a Christian understanding of science. So this is probably one of my favorite arguments, and probably, I think, the easiest argument to memorize and just kind of spout off. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument, and this is from a man named William Lane Craig, who we've already met a little bit. And not even going to look at my notes. It's that easy to memorize. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Number 2, the universe began to exist. And 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. The first one, everything that begins to exist has a cause, is pretty uncontroversial. The universe began to exist, that's where a lot of people take some issue, because they want to say the universe has existed forever, or it's like going in and out and just kind of this wave function type of thing. But this argument is logical, and there are no what's called formal fallacies in it. So if premise 1 and 2 are true, then number 3, the universe has a cause, logically is necessitated. So let's kind of use that same idea of gleaning the basic information out of this argument for kind of our purposes, because as we looked at Genesis 1 and Psalm 19, that's kind of what we were doing. We're looking for the basic elements of it so that we can utilize Scripture in philosophy and science to our benefit, to not just help prove what Scripture is teaching is true, but also that the world matches it. And at its most basic, the Kalam shows that we have a creator that is knowable to some extent through the hard sciences. We're not going to get all of the different attributes of God from looking out into the world, but we can get some of them. That we are not the byproducts of natural processes only, which falls well in line with Genesis 1:1, 26, 28, and Psalm 19. Remember how we talked about setting our views kind of to the side so we can kind of look at these things? Regardless of how you understand the science behind what's going on with the Kalam, you can still use and utilize the Kalam if you're a young earth creationist, if you're a theistic evolutionist. Those are the two views on either side of Christianity. You can still utilize this argument at its most basic to be like, hey, science is kind of pointing us towards a God that exists and that created the world and the universe that we live in. So that's going to lead us towards talking about something like the Big Bang and how Genesis 1:1, when we look at it, let me pull it back up again. You guys don't have to pull it up. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Kind of sounds like something Big Bang-ish, right? It just kind of appeared. So we don't necessarily have to be afraid of the word Big Bang, but we might be able to use it to our advantage, even if you are a young earth creationist or a theistic evolution person. So, how do we live now that we have a deeper understanding of how to look at science and ourselves? For one, we can love each other better despite our differences, because these differences are on the peripherals of the doctrine of creation. Young earth creationism, old earth creationism, theistic evolution, those are on the periphery of Genesis 1:1, that God created everything, and Genesis 1:26 and 28, that we are made in his image. Beyond that, those are peripheral matters. But how does this relate to evangelism? Number one, it breaks down barriers. Because if we can talk about these things using the type of language that, let's say, a scientist understands, that we're going to be able to sit down and actually have a conversation rather than talking past each other. Because we're going to use terms and things like that he's not going to understand, and he's going to use terms and things like that we don't understand. But also that God provides satisfaction and fulfills the natural truth-seeking urge. Because the scientist is seeking truth. The Christian is seeking truth. We can meet in the middle and say, hey, we're seeking truth. How does it work together? But then also recognizing, and this is where meeting in the middle helps, is that science is only one part of the equation. We're going to need philosophy and theology to back it up. We've already said that this is going to be able to get us to talk about things and anticipate scientific objections to the gospel. Because if we can anticipate these objections, not only are we prepared, and we talked about in 1 Peter 3:15, we always need to be prepared to give a defense for the hope that we have within us. But as we do it, and as we break down the barriers, as we talk about these things, we are then able to be gentle and respectful of that person and their profession and proclivities. Like me, as someone who very much enjoys philosophy, that's why I didn't talk about the science. I'm not a science guy. Just like if I was talking to a scientist, I would have to be a lot more well prepared for that. So if you know that you're going into a science class, if you're a college student or you have college students that you know at church in your family, encourage them to dig into it a little bit. So be prepared. Do the hard work. Because it's going to benefit you, whether it's pastorally to yourself or evangelistically, which is also something that we're all called to do. Matthew 28, Great Commission. Put those two together, and the church then becomes extremely powerful. Thank you.